In our last video, we talked a bit about intersexual selection, meaning between the sexes, and that amounts often to mate choice, usually females choosing between males and males competing for the attention of females and trying to impress. That's usually why you have showy males, for instance, more often if you look at birds and insects and things. But intrasexual selection is also important, and this is where two individuals within the same sex, usually males and males, are competing for access to female mates. And because it's usually male-male, we call it sometimes male-male mate competition. And this often involves agonistic or aggressive behavior, sometimes even ritualized contests, because actual fighting can leave even the winner harmed. So very often, just like humans, if I line up next to somebody and they are clearly much larger than I am, I will probably back away before we actually fight, right? Same thing happens in other organisms. So here we have kangaroos boxing, right? This is a classic example from down under of male-male competition. But very often they will line up and, again, just compare size. Sometimes the calculations behind these behavioral strategies can be fairly complicated, and partly that's because sometimes which behavioral strategy is best in terms of fitness may depend upon the behavioral strategies of other individuals in your population. And this brings up game theory, which is something that was a theory in economics but has been co-opted by biology, and it evaluates alternative strategies where the outcome of those strategies depends on the other individuals in your population, what strategy they pick. And so the classic example of game theory in psychology and economics is prisoner's dilemma, right? Do you rat on your co-conspirator? I'm not going to go into the prisoner's dilemma very deeply, but Google it if you're confused about this idea of game theory. But here's an example in biology. So you have a side-blotched lizard, and there are 3 different colored lizards, but those colors are associated with a strategy of obtaining mates. So for instance, orange-throated males are aggressive, and that means that they defend large territories. They fight to keep males far away from their territories, whereas blue throats defend much smaller territories. Yellow throats are not territorial. They mimic females, and they're very sneaky, and they try to sneak into someone's territory to steal a mate. And you can see these individuals right here. Now you may think, well, of course, it's going to be most beneficial to be orange-throated, be aggressive, and have large territories to defend, and this means that you have more females to mate with. And that's true sometimes, especially if you're competing with blue throats who defend small territories, then you're going to end up with more territory and more females. But large territories are more difficult to defend from yellow-throated sneaky males who come in when you're at the other end of the territory and sneak in and mate with the females in your territory. It makes more sense to be blue-throated if there are a lot of yellow-throats around because your small territories are easier to defend. And it kind of becomes a rock, paper, scissors thing. Rock is only the best strategy if the other person has scissors. If the other person has paper, then you don't want to be rock, you want to be scissors, etc. And this is game theory, right? Your strategy depends on the success of the other strategies, and this can lead to frequency-dependent selection, which we talked about in the past when we talked about the fish who eat scales, and you have left-mouthed and right-mouthed fish, and the frequency of left-mouthed fish is what impacts the success of right-mouthed fish. There's one type of behavior which doesn't seem to fit well, on face value at least, within natural selection, the idea of the survival of the fittest. And that's altruism. These are behaviors that benefit another individual at the expense of yourself. So theoretically, you might help somebody else become more fit at the expense of your own fitness. So we think selfish behaviors tend to benefit individuals, and this is often the case. So how do altruistic behaviors evolve? And you do see these in nature. For instance, Belding's ground squirrels make alarm calls to warn the rest of the folks in their colony if they see a predator. And that makes them more likely to be the one noticed by the predator, at least marginally more likely. So it's not a huge cost, but there is some cost to that. They are likelier to get killed, but they're warning everybody else so that they have notice to hide. Naked mole rats and other eusocial organisms like bees and ants may sacrifice their lives to protect kings and queens who are the reproductive individuals, and the other individuals that are not kings and queens don't actually reproduce for the colony. So they're giving up their ability to reproduce for the king or the queen. This, by the way, is a queen naked mole rat. There you go. One way that we can explain altruistic behavior is by inclusive fitness. And this is the idea that really what natural selection acts on are genes, right? It allows genes to be passed on, and the genes that pass on that code for certain structures or behaviors, those structures or behaviors, if they're beneficial, right, they spread in the population. But you aren't the only person with your genes, right? Your siblings share about half of your genes, and your cousins share about a quarter of your genes. Your nieces and nephews also share a quarter of your genes, and your grandchildren, for instance. And so, if you do something that might sacrifice your ability to survive and reproduce, but helps 2 or 3 or 5 of your siblings reproduce, that may actually be better for your genes in the long run. This idea was proposed by William Hamilton, and he put forward a quantitative measure for accounting for this. And there are 3 main variables. B, which is the benefit to the recipient of the behavior, right? So if I do something for you, how much are you benefited? C, which is the cost to the altruistic individual. So if I did something for you, how much are you benefited, but also how much is the cost for me? And then the coefficient of relatedness. How close are we related? In essence, how many of my genes are you carrying? Because again, any siblings, and we talked about this in meiosis last semester, so hopefully you're kind of familiar with this, are likely to share, on average, 50% of their genes with their siblings. In that case, R, or the coefficient of relatedness, would be 0.5, or half. So if the benefit multiplied by the coefficient of relatedness is greater than the cost to the altruistic animal, then that should be on net a benefit for the genes in terms of fitness. So the more related you are, or the higher the benefit is, or both, the more likely it is that you'll evolve to perform a behavior. The greater the cost is, the less likely you are to perform a behavior. Right? So this equation, this inequality, is called Hamilton's rule. So imagine you have a girl who risks her life to save her brother. If on average you have 2 kids, the brother now survives to have 2 kids, right? So the benefit to him is 2. And the sister has a 25% chance of dying in this particular scenario. So the cost to her is 0.25 times 2, right? So 0.5, because on average, right, you lose half a kid, right? Really, you have a 25% chance of losing all your kids, but whatever. The equation is 0.5 then. And so you share half your genes, so the coefficient of relatedness is 0.5. So if you take R, 0.5, times B, 2, so that gives you 1. Is that greater than the cost, or 0.5? Yes, it is. And so you would expect a sister to perform a behavior that gives her about a 25% chance of dying if it's going to save her brother. This whole idea is called kin selection. It's natural selection that favors behaviors, altruistic behaviors that will enhance the success of your relatives. And you're not necessarily doing a mathematical equation in your head before you do a behavior. It's just that over time, the kinds of behaviors that are likely to come out on the positive side of Hamilton's rule are more likely to evolve. So in Belding's ground squirrels, you're warning family groups, essentially. And so it's likely that you are benefiting others that have your genes, and so kin selection, or Hamilton's rule, would favor those warning calls. And most alarm calls are given by females who grew up in that community. Males tend to leave and go mate, find new communities to mate, and more genetic diversity there. And males are less related than to the individuals in their group, and they're less likely to give those warning calls. So this fits with kin selection. And this was a study done to see how far from their birthplace males versus females have generally moved, and this was in an effort to account for that difference in warning calls. Naked mole rats living in a colony with a bunch of individuals that are closely related are what we call eusocial organisms. And this means that most of them are non-reproductive, right? They only have one set of reproductive individuals in the colony. We call those kings and queens, and those are close relatives. And so they live to benefit the reproduction of the kings and queens. This is something that we also see in insects, hymenopteran insects like bees and ants and wasps. But kin selection, or Hamilton's rule, inclusive fitness, isn't necessary to account for all altruism. Another hypothesis to explain altruism is reciprocal altruism. This means you have behavior toward unrelated individuals that may be altruistic, but you expect that they will return that altruistic behavior in the future, tit for tat. This is something that's more likely to evolve in stable social groups, where the individuals that you're behaving altruistically towards, you're likely to see again, right? So cheaters can be punished, for instance, and those who reciprocate, right, you will reciprocate back to, and we think of that as just being a good neighbor, for instance, right? But we even use the word neighbor, right, which implies someone who lives close to us that we're going to see again. If these are strangers, and again, I'm talking humans, but this is just true to animals broadly. If you are solitary individuals and you don't live in stable social groups, there's no evolutionary reason for you to behave altruistically toward an individual that you're never going to see again. And so those behaviors are less likely to evolve. And game theorists have run computer program competitions to see what strategy is the best in different environments. And in a tit-for-tat strategy, individuals will always cooperate on the first encounter, always be altruistic, and then after that, you treat the individual the same way that they have treated you the last time that you met. So if you meet a cheater, you don't cooperate with them or act altruistically to them after that. And so if everyone or a critical mass of individuals are behaving in that way, then it benefits you to be altruistic, to have a tit-for-tat strategy or practice reciprocal altruism. In many cases, again, specifically in stable social groups, individuals who engage in reciprocal altruism will have higher fitness than those who are always selfish. Now, humans are fascinating because we have very complex social lives and we display altruistic behavior in all sorts of ways. We also have a lot of social learning. The most complex social learning that we know about in the animal kingdom. And there are some complex examples of social learning in the animal kingdom, but nothing that compares to our cultural transmission. We literally have schools like Cincinnati State set up with the intent of passing on cultural transmission, cultural learning to other individuals. And you can study human culture with evolutionary theory. It's a little bit more difficult because it's so complex, but it's possible and it's fascinating. And this discipline is called sociobiology, and this was founded by E.O. Wilson, who's still alive today. I got to meet him in college. He came and spoke where I went to undergrad, and he's still publishing books into his 90s now. And while we see learning like imprinting and spatial learning and even problem solving and cognition and social learning and associative learning in lots of other animals, culture, to the extent that we have it in humans, really might be the thing that sets us apart. The level to which ideas can move through a society faster than genes can. And this is the idea of a meme. Memes, before they meant, a picture that you put big block letters over top of that meant something funny. Meme was a biological idea put forward by Richard Dawkins that said that ideas can move and be selected for or against in similar ways to genes in terms of natural selection.